school from coming. Debra is a clinical professor of law, the associate dean for experiential education, and the director of the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic at the University of Michigan Law School. Her work, both in the clinic representing clients and outside the clinic through research and interdisciplinary collaborations, focuses on integrating advocacy into the healthcare system to address social determinants of health. And today she'll be giving a talk to us on education rights for children. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you to the three live humans who are here with me in this room, because it is hard to talk into the void. And I completely understand why everybody else is at home. I am hoping for this to be interactive, so feel free to participate even for the Zoomies and not just the roomies, as we used to say during COVID. Okay, so I am the director of the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic at the law school, and this is a clinic. Legal clinics are similar to medical clinics in that, like, real live human beings who need help come to us for help, but instead of medical care, we're giving them legal representation. So the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic represents low-income families on legal issues connected to child health. We work to address social determinants of health. And as we're going to discuss very shortly, education is a very important social determinant of health. And so we work with doctors, we work with social workers. I have pediatric residents do a rotation through the clinic, and they work alongside our law students. I always have a social work intern from the School of Social Work working alongside the law students. And our goal is to provide holistic representation to families who are struggling with legal issues that affect child health and well-being. And please feel free along the way to ask any questions, even though I cannot see you, so you will just have to shout or speak in a regular voice. Okay, so our learning objectives for today are to review the core guarantees of laws that protect children in school, to identify shortcomings in these laws and in their implementation, and to explore systemic solutions. So let's start with the importance of education. Why are we talking about education at CHEAR? I think a lot of people understand, probably everybody here understands how important education is to health. It is strongly associated with life expectancy, morbidity, health behaviors. Educational attainment plays an important role in health by shaping opportunities for employment and income. And educational inequality deepens economic inequality. So there have been many studies that show that education and wealth established earlier in life are strongly associated with disparities in healthy aging. All right, so education shapes lives. It's key to lifting people out of poverty and reducing socioeconomic and political inequalities. And given the amount of data we have on the importance of education, let's talk about how we support it and how we protect it. Don't get your hopes way up here, but you can have them a little bit up. Let's start with our federal educational protections. So the United States Constitution has no fundamental right to education. The 14th Amendment, which guarantees, this is going to be a little bit of a legal lecture. The 14th Amendment, which guarantees due process and equal protection of the laws, has been used to address inequality in the educational context. Like, you have probably heard of Brown versus Board of Education, a famous Supreme Court case that served to desegregate, or whatever, it was supposed to desegregate schools on the basis of race. That was the case that held that separate is not equal. That case was grounded in the 14th Amendment in equal protection, not in a fundamental right to education, because there is no fundamental right to education in the US Constitution. We do have a number of federal laws that protect education, despite the lack of protection in the Constitution. There's the Every Student Succeeds Act, which was formerly No Child Left Behind. And then to protect students with disabilities, there's Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act of 1975. All right, let's go into each one of these individually. So the Every Student Succeed Act, let's start with this one. The federal government and the states are always doing a dance around education. It's a dance about federal control and local control. The ESSA was signed by Obama in 2015 to replace No Child Left Behind. It is a broad act that delivers federal funds to schools in exchange for the adoption of a certain set of standards and rules. And this, so you know, is how much of federal law works. It is enacted through the spending clause of the US Constitution, because the federal government doesn't just have the power to tell states what to do, but it can hold out the promise of money to states in exchange for states adopting federal laws. This is why we have Medicaid in states too. It is because it is federal funding. So it is, yes, it is through federal funding. So the core promises of this act is that the purpose is to provide all children significant opportunity to receive a fair, equitable, and high-quality education and to close educational achievement gaps. That sounds so good. It provides block grants to states, that means money. And there is a reduced emphasis on standardized tests. You might recall No Child Left Behind had a very intense emphasis on standardized tests, and schools risked losing funding and risked shutting down if their students did not perform up to a certain level. And there were widespread, highly publicized cheating scandals throughout the country because schools did not want to be shut down. And so it seemed easier to change students' test scores than to help the students achieve whatever benchmarks. And there were all sorts of problems with the tests themselves. So lots of people had lots of problems with No Child Left Behind. And so we have a more flexible system with a reduced emphasis on standardized tests through the Every Student Succeed Act. It gave more flexibility to the state. So this.
Does that mean that the states have to adopt the Common Core in order to get
They
the
do
money?
not have to adopt the Common Core, but it sets out the Common Core as an option. It like sets out these federal benchmarks that states can adopt. There's way more flexibility for states under this act. More live humans. The problem is that there's no private right of action. So what this means is that if I believe that my children are not getting a fair, equitable, and high quality education, I cannot bring a lawsuit against the state to enforce this act. There's no private right of action. So let's move on to laws in which there are private rights of action. And these are the laws that protect students with disabilities. So there are two main laws, and I'll talk about each one of them briefly. The first one is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. Section 504 was born of the civil rights movement. It provides equal access to programs and services that receive federal funds. We just saw in the Every Student Succeeds Act, that is a way that schools receive federal funds. So all public schools receive federal funds, and all public schools are obligated to follow Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act to provide equal access to programs and services. So this includes charter schools. Charter schools receive federal dollars. I always feel like it's important to include that. It does not include private schools. parents in the 1970s, like the disability rights movement really took its lessons from the civil rights movement. The disability rights movement saw like millions of children with disabilities excluded from schools. And so the parents like saw what was happening in the parents of these kids saw what was happening in the racial context and imported those lessons to the disability rights movement and succeeded in passing and like generating the pressure through lawsuits that led to federal laws and generating the pressures for the enactment of these very, very important laws. So Section 504. Section 504 is a very broad tent. It is not hard to qualify for protections. The eligibility requires a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. So major life activities are breathing, eating, learning, walking, like there are all sorts of disabilities that would qualify a child for support under Section 504. Think about a child with asthma who can't go outside on very cold days because the cold air triggers their asthma. They might have an accommodation to stay indoors for recess on cold days. Think about a child with diabetes who might have to test their blood sugar in class. And now the technology is so much better. Kids aren't giving themselves, you know this better than I do, they're not giving themselves insulin shots in class anymore, thankfully. But Section 504 was really important in that context. Kids with food allergies, all sorts of disabilities qualify for protection under 504. When we think about special education, we're really thinking about IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And this was enacted in 1975, again, like right in the heart of the civil rights movement and the disability rights movement. IDEA provides much more robust protections for students with disabilities. It is a much more detailed law. It is a very long law with implementing regulations. Like there's a lot of content to it that protects students with disabilities. Section 504, in contrast, is extremely short. So let me get into some of the core ideas of IDEA. Sorry, that pun was not intended. Okay, let's call them core promises, not core ideas. So the core promises of special education are, well, one, all accommodations for children are supposed to be grounded in data. So the whole process starts with a multidisciplinary evaluation. If a parent or a school suspects that a child has a disability, the school district parent can request in writing that a school district evaluate their child, or the school could approach the parent and say, we would like to evaluate your child. The parent has to consent to evaluation. And so there should be a comprehensive evaluation that includes different assessments and different professionals to determine eligibility. And I accidentally skipped over like this whole list. These are all the categories of eligibility under IDEA. So in contrast to Section 504, which is a very broad tent, IDEA is much narrower. You have to meet one of the definitions of these disabilities to qualify for the protections of special education. And the process is that there is this multidisciplinary evaluation. There can be a tension here between medical definitions of disability and legal definitions of disability. And I see this a lot as an advocate, where a child might be diagnosed in a clinical setting with autism, for example, and the school district does their comprehensive evaluation and they say like, okay, this child might have a clinical diagnosis of autism, but they don't meet the legal definition of autism. We're not going to give them an IEP, an individualized education program based on that autism category. So there's sometimes tension there. And, you know, directing a medical legal partnership, I like throw my body down as a bridge between the medical community and the school district community and try to explain the law to both sides. But when a child is deemed eligible under one of those 14 categories for special education, then the school district convenes to write an IEP, an individualized education program for the child. And what's really important to know about IEPs is that the eligibility category opens the door, but you all know children are complex, people are complex. There's often more than one thing going on. The IEP now has to address everything that child is facing, not just the eligibility category that opened the door to special education. You can imagine a universe in which a school district conducts an evaluation and a parent disagrees with the result of the evaluation, like, my child does have autism, my child does need services in school for autism. The law provides parents this tool, access to an independent educational evaluation at public expense. Public expense means free to the parent. Independent means not employed by the school district. Like, often that is where my lovely relationship with Michigan Medicine comes in handy, because I can rope some providers in to do an independent evaluation of a child, which is extremely helpful. School districts do not need to adopt the findings of these evaluations, but they do need to consider them. And, you know, it can be hard to argue, it can be hard for them to argue with expertise. So that is a little bit about the process, and there's so much more to say about it, but time is short. So let me talk about, like, what are we getting with an IEP? What is an IEP actually providing children? So one, the most important is FAPE, free, appropriate public education in the least restrictive environment. And I wanted to say that these 5 acronyms are just 5 of a million acronyms in the special education context. And one of the things I do when I go with parents to IEP meetings is I ask a lot of questions, even when I know the answers to the questions, because school districts speak in code and parents don't understand what they're talking about. And I try to model that it's okay to ask questions, it's okay to not know what these words mean, and it's so super important to ask. Anyway, all right, we're going to talk about FAPE and least restrictive environment in a little more detail, but we'll do it through a case example. So I'm going to present 2 case examples today, and they are both patients who were referred to the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic by physicians at Michigan Medicine. So we'll start with Mabel. She is 6 years old. She has stage 2 kidney failure. She is trach and vent dependent. She has hearing loss. She is immunosuppressed. She has no white blood cells. I did not know that was a thing, but it is. So it is too dangerous for Mabel to go to school, and she is on home instruction. She gets 6 hours per week of home instruction, but it was recently reduced to 4 hours. Her mother is very, very unhappy with that reduction. Mabel has an assistive communication device. It is extremely frustrating for her. She hits herself when she can't find the words she wants. And Mabel's mother really wants her to receive American Sign Language instruction. She thinks that will help. They do some signing at home and it calms Mabel down. It helps her communicate. It gives her another communication tool. Okay, so what does the school district owe this little girl? So they owe her, because she qualifies for special education, they owe her a free, appropriate public education. Let's tease this apart a little bit. What does free mean? Free means free, no cost to parents. There is a cost, somebody pays the cost, it's just not the parent. We'll skip the word appropriate because that's where all the tension is. We're going to come back to it, I promise. Public means in public school. children with disabilities who qualify for special education are entitled to a public education. Every now and then, if a public school is not equipped to deliver FAPE, free appropriate public education, it will pay for a child to attend private school. This does not happen a lot, but it does happen because public schools cannot always meet the needs of every child, and sometimes there's a private school that is better equipped to meet the child's needs. It's a high bar. Public schools do not want to pay for children to attend private school, as you can imagine. Okay, so what does appropriate mean? Appropriate means that the IEP, the Individualized Education Program, this is very like legal language, reasonably calculated to enable a child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. I want you to know that that language is a recent addition by the US Supreme Court just a couple of years ago. We didn't used to have that language in light of the child's circumstances. It seems small, but it was actually progress. FAPE does not mean the best education possible. It does not mean maximizing a child's potential. It's not a choice of methodology. It's not a choice of building. But we do need to see that a child is making progress. And all the tension in this standard is between free and appropriate, like something that a parent might feel is really, really important for a child has to be provided free to that child. And so a school district sometimes will argue that whatever is being requested is not appropriate for a child when it feels like really obvious that what they're saying is we don't want to pay for it, but it's illegal to say, well, we're not going to pay for it. Yes, Gary Freed.
Would that be much different than a child not having an IEP? Because I can, having, as you, I'm sure, children in the school system, sometimes you recognize they're not getting the best education possible, and one doesn't have a choice of teaching methods. And so this seems, at least philosophically, consistent with public education, period. Is that right?
Yes, it gives children with disabilities extra protection because of the long history of exclusion and the long history of just like not educating students with disabilities.
Yeah.
But yes, it doesn't, it's just a boost. It's like, we're gonna pay special attention to you. We're gonna develop a whole plan. And I have been at IEP meetings where there are 20 people in the room, all to develop an IEP for one young child. Like that to me is remarkable, like all the attention that is paid to the individual child. And still, like we live in a world of limited resources, there are constraints. Okay, so when courts are trying to decide, like if a parent is like, you are not providing my child FAPE, Mabel's mother, you are not providing Mabel everything she needs to make progress. And if her mother files a lawsuit, and that is one of our options that we're considering, the court in deciding whether the school district provided FAPE is going to look at procedure. Was the IEP developed properly? There are all these rules, which I'm not going to get into, about the development of IEPs. Was it implemented properly? Like if a speech therapist is supposed to show up at her house for 1 hour a week, is that speech therapist actually showing up at her house for 1 hour a week? So the courts are going to look to procedure and also substance. Is the IEP reasonably calculated to confer educational benefit? And again, we could like spend much more time on this, but alas, we are moving forward. The other core promise of special education is education in the least restrictive environment. This means that to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities are to be educated alongside their non-disabled peers. So removal to separate classes, separate schools should only happen if the nature and severity of the disability is such that education in the regular classroom with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So it's an assessment, like what is the best place for the child to receive their education? It's interesting because it's often like the most important thing to just that parents want to discuss, like where is my child going to school? But this discussion, the placement discussion, happens at the very end of the meeting. Like first, we have a whole discussion about the child and their strengths and challenges and medical issues and all the supports they need. And then we identify goals and objectives, and then we talk about placement. So you have to like hold yourself back. You're not allowed to talk about placement first, even though parents spend a lot of time agonizing about that. So what does this mean for Mabel? Like she can't go to school. She's too immunosuppressed. She has to stay at home. But is there a way to integrate her at least a little bit with her peers at school? Because she's as isolated as a child can possibly be. So I'm sure people in this room have ideas. Feel free to throw out an idea while I take a drink of water.
I have a formative question.
Yes.
Is the overriding thought that she will always benefit by being engaged with peers? Because I could hypothesize a time where even if parents want it, it may actually not be in the best interest of a child, or potentially, one might say, not in the best interest of the other, I don't know, 25 kids in the classroom.
Yeah, so that goes back to appropriate. There are no, everything in IDEA, and it's not an accident that it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and an individualized education program. It is individually tailored. So if it is not appropriate for Mabel to spend any time with her peers, then you know, there could be disagreement between parents and schools. Somebody will prevail, usually the schools. But it's a question to be discussed. There are no absolutes.
Got it, thank you.
And so for Mabel, you can imagine zooming her in for music, or like you can imagine zooming her in to interact with her peers in some way. Like
Yeah.
that is a benefit of virtual education, even though I'm going to spend some time talking about the evils of virtual education. Okay, so a few minutes on options for parents. If parents disagree with schools based on the evaluations, based on the delivery of FAPE, based on the placement, there are all sorts of options. There are state administrative complaints that they can file with the Michigan Department of Education. This is actually very easy to do. Like it doesn't have to be like a perfectly crafted legal brief. The parent can there are forms available online through the Michigan Department of Education, and parents can fill out a form like this is what's happening in school, and the department will investigate and will have a conversation with the school, have a conversation with the parents, and make findings and recommendations. So this is like a low barrier way for a parent to register their dissatisfaction. A due process hearing complaint is a much more intense way for a parent to register their dissatisfaction, and it also is more appropriate for more complex cases because it leads to a trial with witnesses and evidence. And if a parent has received an independent educational evaluation, they can introduce that report into evidence. They can hopefully get the professional who evaluated the child to testify at the hearing. This is a big undertaking. Like if you think about parents, if you think about all parents, everybody's stretched very, very thin. If you think about parents with disability, parents of children with disabilities, they are stretched even thinner. And then the clinic that I'm running is representing parents who are poor with children who have disabilities. Like these parents might work jobs that do not allow them any time off, or they don't get paid if they take time off. So the due process hearing is available. It is hard for people to access. School districts always have lawyers, always. And parents really need lawyers if they're gonna prevail in these hearings.
We have a question in the
Yeah.
chat. How long does the investigation by MDE normally take?
60 days. Another possibility, and we'll talk more about this, is filing a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the US Department of Education. That's what you do when there's a 504 violation. This is too in the weeds, but when there's the IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, has a whole system for processing complaints. 504 has the US Department of Education, the Office for Civil Rights. Don't know what's gonna happen with that. There's also in the new administration, that was a nod to the new administration. There's also mediation that is available to parents at any point. And that can be a good option because when you think about relationships between parents and school districts, that is an ongoing relationship. And like a child like Mabel, who is 6 years old, that is a long-term relationship unless the parents have the ability to up and move, which many people do not have that ability and flexibility. So mediation is a nice option when there are disputes that feel intractable and people need a little bit of help. And it's free. That is a good thing to know. Okay. Shifting gears a little bit because I want to spend some time with school discipline. So let's talk about school discipline through another case example. So there's a pediatrician at the Ypsilanti Health Center who referred Jacob, all names have been changed, by the way, who referred Jacob, a 15-year-old boy in the Detroit public schools. And Jacob was found with drawings in his binder that were very upsetting to school personnel. I am going to show them to you in a second. And the school sent him home. So I don't want to keep you wondering and guessing. Let's just see the drawings and then we'll go back. Okay, so my kids are old. I didn't really know who Bluey was, but for anybody with young children, you might recognize Bluey. So in one picture that Jacob drew, Bluey is smoking a joint. And in another, Bluey is holding a gun upside down, not pointing it at anybody. Okay, so these two drawings were in Jacob's binder. School district, very alarmed, sent him home, refused to allow him to return to school. They required the mother to get a psychiatric evaluation of him. This took a little time. The doctor did say that Jacob does not seem to be a threat to himself or others, that he's not depressed. I mean, he was as cleared as a child can be. Like nobody can say with 100% certainty that anyone's going to do or not do something. But the person who evaluated Jacob did not feel concerned about him. Nevertheless, the school placed Jacob on, quote, administrative leave. And it's important to know that Jacob has a 504 plan for ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So he has some protections under 504 that we're going to talk about. But, this case raises some questions. Why did those drawings trigger such an intense response? I mean, I think schools are so afraid of school shootings, and I understand as a parent, I understand that fear, but I think there is an extreme overreaction and like exclusionary discipline that is completely inappropriate in lots of cases. So that could be what's going on here. Who knows what else is going on here? And maybe racism, not sure. What is administrative leave? We have heard of administrative leave in the context of police officers, but not really in the context of children at school. Children at school, when they are being excluded from school, are typically suspended or expelled. Here, they put him in a category that arguably does not exist to keep him out of school. So that is the case that we got in the clinic. And then like our task is to try to figure out like, what can we do to help this child? Because like back to where we started, education is such an important social determinant of health. Like my goal is almost always going to be to return a child to school with the appropriate behavioral supports. So here, okay, these are the lovely drawings again. What a talented artist. The school district said to Jacob's mother, we will continue to educate him, but only through virtual education. You may enroll him in my virtual academy, but he will not be permitted to attend in-person school anymore. I have a bunch of concerns about this. I imagine some of you might have concerns about this, but let's keep going. All right. There are federal protections for kids with disabilities who are facing school discipline that will take them out of school. Again, these protections arise from a history of school exclusion. We know that kids where a school district can send a child home, they're going to send a child home because it is just easier to educate all the typically developing children who need the exact same type of education. And it is more challenging, more costly to educate, you know, the wide variety of children in our midst. So, but we do have protections. So if a child is facing a school removal for 10 school days or more, this protection comes into play. They are entitled to what's called a manifestation determination review. So again, this is only triggered when the child is facing exclusion for 10 school days or more. Lots of people, or it is a totally fair question to ask, like, why is 10 days the trigger? Like 10 days is quite a lot of school. Think about missing work for 10 days and how far behind you would feel. For a child to miss 10 days of school, they would be extremely far behind and also embarrassed, disconnected from their peers. Like it's very significant. Nevertheless, we see 10 days as a change in educational placement. And when a child is facing that, the IEP team, if the child has an IEP, or the 504 team, if the child has a 504 plan, convene, and they're asking two questions. One, was the child's conduct directly or substantially related to the child's disability? In this case, Jacob has ADHD. So the question would be, was his conduct directly or substantially related to his ADHD? I'm sure people here could come up with arguments for why those drawings are related to his ADHD, or the fact that he brought them to school could be related to his ADHD or not. There are people, you know, reasonable minds can disagree about the relatedness. The other question that they have to ask is, was the conduct the direct result of the local educational agency's failure to implement the child's IEP or 504 plan? They will tell you from experience, school districts will never, ever, ever answer yes to the second question. Like really, truly, in 20 years, I've never seen them answer yes to the second question, but they will sometimes say yes to the first, and it really helps. That is where I draw on my medical legal partnership, and I've brought pediatricians, behavioral health specialists to these meetings, or to call into the meetings or submit a letter to the meetings, explaining the child's disability and explaining how it can be connected to the behavior. Any questions on this? I'm like saying a lot of words.
I'm curious, like in this case, the child had a 504, not an IEP.
Mhm.
Is that material at all? And I mean, it has to be to some degree, right?
Yes, the 504 universe is much more vague because there is there's not nearly as much law. So if a child is much more protected with an IEP. Like if a child can be eligible for an IEP, I would 100% advocate for that child to get an IEP because it is a much more detailed plan with much more detailed protections. It's not exactly clear what happens in the 504 context.
Well, I'm just curious, like, is it considered a failure in some way that this ADHD is a qualifying diagnosis for IEPs potentially, right?
It
And
can
for,
be.
or for 504, so
Yep.
was there an upstream kind of problem where this child should have had an IEP instead of a 504?
That is a great question. Like, that would be a really important question to ask. Like, what else was going on with Jacob in school? Should he have qualified for an IEP? School districts have an affirmative obligation under, this is also part of the IDEA, under something called Child Find, to identify children with disabilities and evaluate them for special education. Was this a Child Find violation? Maybe. Okay. If the answer to any of these questions is yes, the child gets returned to school and the school district is supposed to retool their IEP or their 504 plan and consider adding a behavior intervention plan, conducting what's called a functional behavioral assessment and creating a behavior plan. Alas, in this case, the team answered no. And when the team answers no to both questions, they can treat the child like any other child without a disability and exclude them from school. Okay, let's talk about some state educational protections. I promise this is going to all weave together. So you will recall that the federal Constitution has no fundamental right to education. So too the Michigan Constitution has no fundamental right to education. Our Constitution says that the legislature shall maintain and support a system of free public elementary and secondary schools as defined by law. And then it goes on to say that school districts cannot discriminate based on religion, creed, race, color, or national origin, and that no public money can be spent on private school or parochial school. That's a synopsis. That is not a direct quote from the text. There is a Michigan law that was enacted in 2017 that that recognized the harms of school exclusion and created a rebuttable presumption that there should not be long-term school exclusion, that we should not be suspending children in a long-term way or expelling them. But and requires the school district to consider these 7 factors, which are the age of the student, the disciplinary history, the seriousness of the offense, whether the student has a disability, whether the violation threatened the health or safety of pupils or staff members, whether restorative practices would be helpful, and whether a lesser intervention is appropriate to address the behavior. Gosh, I am running out of time. Okay, school discipline data, there's a ton. The moral of the story is excluding children from school is really, really bad for children. School policies, not student behavior, are the primary drivers of suspension and expulsion. Exclusionary discipline is disproportionately applied to students of color. That is true for Jacob. Students with disabilities, true for Jacob, and low-income students, true for Jacob. Black students without disabilities are more than 3 times as likely as their white peers without disabilities to be expelled or suspended. I can go on. Exclusionary discipline sets the stage for student disenfranchisement, disconnectedness from school, academic failure, dropout, and you've probably heard of the school to prison pipeline. So future criminal behavior. There was a recent study that showed that suspensions in 10th grade alone produced more than 67,000 dropouts in the United States. Jacob is a 10th grader, and generated social costs of more than $35 billion. More, Black students represent 15% of students, but make up 35% of students suspended once, 44% of students suspended twice, and 36% of students expelled. The Obama administration, way back in the day, released a long report and a guidance to school administrators about the disproportionate representation of minority students and students with disabilities among those excluded from school. And the first Trump administration rescinded that guidance. Okay. So Jacob is excluded from school. He's saying you can come back, but only to virtual school. Let's talk about distance learning for a minute. So there have been some studies, not a lot that I could find at least, about the consequences of remote education. So distance learning increases academic difficulties, especially in students with ADHD. There's a lack of immediate feedback, there's social isolation, lack of movement, distraction, increase in stress, anxiety, depression. I mean, I think a lot of us who had children during COVID can just tell you that all these things are true. But I think that's probably not sufficient, but I wish it were. Virtual learning during the COVID-19 pandemic increased chronic absenteeism when students returned to school. So there are a lot of potential harms when children are forced to learn remotely. And so this is a problem that Jacob was facing. So what did we in the clinic, in the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic, do for Jacob? We filed a complaint with the Office for Civil Rights in the US Department of Education. We did this a few weeks ago. I have no idea what's going to happen to that. I have no idea what the future of that department is for the next few years. And, you know, we made a few arguments that there was a violation of Section 504, that Jacob was denied FAPE, free appropriate public education, when he was excluded from school, that there were all sorts of procedural problems, that they effectively changed his educational placement when they transferred him to virtual school without due process. Administrative leave is not a thing. It's not in the student code of conduct. How is a child supposed to tailor their behavior to avoid administrative leave when it's not a thing? So that is a violation of due process as well. Okay. The problem here is that there is no fundamental right to education, and the rise in virtual school makes it very easy for school districts to transfer kids and maintain that they are still providing education to kids. There is no right to a high quality public education. There are extra protections for kids with disabilities, but then, you know, there are millions of kids without disabilities who have no protection at all. And there are no parameters around the involuntary transfer to virtual school. Here is a possible systemic solution that I am currently working on. How can we get a fundamental right to education in the Michigan Constitution? Obviously, there are 50 states, and I wasn't going to list the constitutional provisions of all 50 states that deal with education. But I will, and I listed some, and I'll point out a few of them. But I will say that, especially now, in this time of federal uncertainty, and we see this in the abortion context too, people are looking to states to protect individual rights. So the time feels ripe to do something at the state level to protect education. The confluence of the rise in virtual education and the potential erosion of protections at the federal level makes me feel inspired to do some work at the state level. Okay, so other states Colorado has the guarantee of a thorough and uniform system of free public schools. That doesn't feel like a great model to me. Florida, a uniform, efficient, safe, secure, and high-quality system of free public schools that allows students to obtain a high-quality education. That feels much better. Illinois, an efficient system.
Doesn't the word uniform in Florida give you pause?
What is your concern with that?
That it's all the same for everyone.
Maybe, right. It depends how the courts are gonna interpret it,
Right, so I mean, I think that each of those words is deliberate.
of course. And I am learning this as I work on this problem. Yes, each of the words are like carefully chosen and focus group tested. And so, yes, what does uniform mean? Like, uniform could help. Like, when I think about Jacob's case, uniform could potentially help because maybe virtual school doesn't count. I don't know. I really like Montana's, a system of education which will develop the full educational potential of each person. Maybe it helps when you don't have a lot of persons in your state. Equality of educational opportunity is guaranteed to each person, a basic system of free, quality public elementary and secondary schools. That sounds so nice. Okay. So I put some next steps for providers, but I guess let me go back here for a second. Let me tell you what I have learned so far in this nascent effort to try to amend the Michigan Constitution. Like, I'm working with a small group of people. We're trying to develop language to potentially get on the ballot for 2026. We're building networks of support. We are fundraising. I am so naive, I am so new to this, that thankfully I did not ask the question at our first meeting, like, why do we need to fundraise? Turns out, you guys, you need tens of millions of dollars to amend a constitution because it requires people to fan out across the state and collect signatures. You need to bring together focus groups of people to test language. There's just, you need like a whole massive publicity campaign if you're gonna get support. So I'm I'm admitting it to you, I don't know why, but I'm so happy I did not ask that question when they talked about fundraising.
Have there ever been recent efforts to try to amend this in Michigan?
Not to my knowledge. I know that people have been like thinking about it and working on it, and there are ongoing efforts in other states right now. Okay, so potential next steps for you as providers, as researchers. You can ask your patients questions about school, what's happening in school. You can talk to parents about their rights, not in detail. Nobody expects you to be a special education law expert, but just as long as you know that there are rights and there are protections, you can at least say those words to parents. There's a lot of resources online that people can access to read more. That they don't have to parents don't just have to accept what school districts are giving them. There is room to push back. You can make referrals to the Pediatric Advocacy Clinic. There's also the Student Advocacy Center. You can research the effects of distance learning. I think we need more data. And you can become involved in systemic reform efforts. Here are a couple resources. And I made it in 56 minutes and 59 seconds. Any questions in our last 3 minutes?
Question.
Yeah.
Kind of like near the beginning of your presentation, you were talking about like the level of appropriateness for.
Yeah.
Do you see that there is, and I'll use the word uniform, like across districts of like where you see that bar being set, or is there any like legislation or like resources that say like what is the minimum bar that school districts have to provide?
It's a great question. School districts have no obligation to present a menu of options
Yeah.
to parents. So you are gonna see discrepancies based on the resources of a school district. 100%, you're gonna see huge discrepancies between rural school districts and more urban school districts. Suburban school districts have way more resources than rural school districts. You're gonna see discrepancies based on how educated parents are and how empowered they feel. School districts, parents under IDEA are supposed to play a really important role in the development of a child's IEP. Schools, as I mentioned, they speak in code. And the first IEP meeting I went to as somebody who was highly educated and had a graduate degree, I didn't understand what they were talking about, but I felt empowered to ask questions. If a parent is not educated, does not speak English, like you can imagine, people will feel really silenced in that room, like scared to ask, scared to push. That was a long-winded answer to your question.
I have another question, if
Yeah.
that's okay. Do you see a lot, also again, near the beginning of your presentation, where you see the school district having a more rigorous like definition of who qualifies for, you know, a disability than the medical community? I don't see how that like how could that be?
It's a really good question because the statutes were written by lawyers,
Okay, that's right.
not by doctors. And so and also medical definitions move more quickly
Mhm.
than legislation. So it could be that the legislation is lagging. And like the communication is so important, like to the extent that we can explain disabilities or health conditions to school districts, it really helps to get better accommodations in school. But like I remember when I first started practicing in this area of law, one physician said that they were gonna prescribe an IEP, and oh, that would be so nice, but that is not how it works. You have so much power, but you do not have the power to prescribe an IEP.
I guess I'm thinking of a recent case in clinic where I was talking to a family of a kid with ADHD and probably some other developmental problems. And like talked to mom about submitting a written request for like an educational assessment in school, like wrote down some language for her to bring into the school. And then school said, like, he doesn't need this, we're not gonna do it. And that was like a new one to me of how to, like, he didn't even get to get in the door, if that makes sense.
They would say,
And it's
they
all
say
through
why?
report through mom, or like sort of like telephone through mom of hearing what she said, and they just told her like, no, he doesn't need that. So those kinds of situations, I'm like, we didn't even get to the start of legal protection because the school said he doesn't need an like educational assessment.
they are supposed to, like, when a parent puts a request in writing, the school district has a certain number of days to get parental consent to evaluate, and then a certain number of days to conduct the evaluation and convene an IEP team.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess going off of Jess and Nina, like with what Jessica was saying, I was curious how the schools are prepared. Like, is there at least one person on staff that are certified in being able to give those assessments versus the physicians? And how do you know
Yeah.
that they
Yeah.
don't qualify if you didn't assess them?
Yes, so different categories of eligibility or disability will require different professional involvement in the assessment. So sometimes if it's like learning disabilities, the school psychologist and the school social worker and the teachers can handle that. If it's like severe developmental or physical disabilities, physicians will have to be involved.
But does
So-
every school district or school have a psychologist or staff on hand to
They don't,
support?
yes.
You know?
Every school district should have access to a psychologist to do educational assessments. But again, like you're gonna see rural school districts having way fewer resources. And once upon a time, there were nurses in school, and did you know that now there are not nurses in school?
All right.
Yep, there's no
Thank you.
questions on the chat.
Okay, thank you all so very much.
Thank you.